He held a ticket. He had the seat. Yet in front of hundreds of passengers, a single decision stripped it all away. A black CEO, dressed in a simple gray suit, was told he didn't belong in first class. Another man was escorted into his rightful place, champagne in hand, as if authority itself had chosen sides. But what no one realized was that this ordinary passenger was Malcolm Price, the very CEO of the airline. In that moment, the cabin turned into a stage, and every whisper, every phone camera, every cruel laugh became evidence in a story that would explode across the world. What happens when silence isn't surrender, but power waiting to strike? What happens when humiliation at 30,000 feet ignites a reckoning for an entire industry? And how can one man transform a stolen seat into a movement that demands dignity for every traveler, no matter their race, status, or name? Stay with us as we uncover the storm that shook the skies, a story of injustice, strength, and change. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that reveal truth where the world least expects it. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of Northvale International Airport, scattering golden light across the polished marble floor. Travelers hurried through the terminal with their rolling bags clicking against the tiles, some rushing, some lingering, some already sipping their first coffees. Gate C-14 glowed ahead with a sleek sign that read, North Star Airways Flight 418, nonstop to Seattle, in front of the first-class lane, where a soft carpet rolled out like an invitation. The atmosphere was different. It smelled faintly of champagne and warm croissants. The cabin doors stood open, revealing a glimpse of wide leather seats that seemed to cradle the promise of luxury. A steward in a navy vest topped off glasses of sparkling wine, while the curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane hung neatly, like a velvet wall between two worlds. Malcolm Price stood quietly in line, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase. His gray suit was unremarkable, his shoes polished but not new. He looked like another businessman among many, the kind you might pass without a second glance. Yet behind those calm brown eyes lay decades of struggle and triumph. Malcolm Price was not just another passenger. He was the CEO of North Star Airways, the very company that owned the gleaming jet parked at the gate. No one around him knew this. He did not wear his title like armor. He did not need to. The boarding line moved quickly. Passengers greeted with polite smiles. Tickets scanned with a beep. When Malcolm reached the front, he handed his boarding pass to the chief flight attendant, Diana Lewis. She was a woman in her early 40s, her posture flawless, her lipstick carefully painted, her smile professional, yet edged with something sharper. She scanned the pass, glanced at the screen, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. Her smile faltered, just a heartbeat, but it was enough for Malcolm to notice. Seat 2A, she said, her voice coated with politeness but chilled underneath. She lifted her eyes to him, and the sweetness in her tone hardened. I'm sorry, sir, but seat 2A has been reserved for a VIP guest. You'll need to sit in the main cabin for now. We'll verify later. The words cut the air like a blade. Malcolm did not flinch. He simply held her gaze, calm, steady, as though he had been expecting such a moment all along. He had seen those eyes before eyes that measured worth not by ticket or truth, but by assumptions about who deserved to be where. Behind him, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive coat stepped forward. Charles Whitman, known in business circles as a wealthy financier, frowned impatiently. He had the air of a man used to doors opening and seats waiting. He glanced at Malcolm with irritation, then leaned toward Diana. "I always sit there," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "That's my seat." His words carried like a verdict, heavy and unquestioned. A ripple passed through the small crowd. Some passengers tilted their heads, whispering. Others lifted their phones discreetly, screens glowing. One of them was Samantha Ortiz, a freelance journalist with a sharp instinct for moments that cracked open the ordinary to reveal something raw. She had just cleared the gate, and her gut told her not to look away. She pressed record. Through her lens, she caught the image of a black man in a simple gray suit being denied his place in first class, without explanation beyond a vague reserved for VIP. Malcolm slid his boarding pass back into his pocket and picked up his briefcase. He said nothing. He did not argue, did not demand, did not pound his fist. He simply turned and began walking toward economy, his steps unhurried, his face composed. The silence that followed him down the aisle felt heavier than thunder. Passengers' hearts beat faster, though he himself moved like a man crossing a river stone by stone, careful not to disturb the current. Some thought he was powerless. Some thought he had resigned himself. But Malcolm's silence was not surrender. It was restraint, the kind a man learns only after years of fire and battles. He knew when to hold back and when to strike. He reached row 19 and placed his briefcase in the overhead bin. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane swayed gently in the air conditioning. To many, it was fabric. To him, it was a wall of prejudice itself, thin yet heavy enough to divide dignity from disdain. In first class, Charles Whitman leaned back into the plush seat, a glass of champagne already in his hand. His laughter rang out as he clinked glasses with his companions. The sound carried through the curtain, spilling into economy like a reminder that some worlds are measured not in miles, but in privilege. Malcolm sat by the window, folded his arms, and exhaled slowly. The pale morning light spread across his face, and for a moment he let the world blur into silence. His mind wandered to the early mornings years ago, when North Star had only 3 aging aircraft and a skeleton crew of believers. He remembered scraping for funding, convincing mechanics to trust him, promising attendants that an airline could be built on dignity as much as steel. And now, here he was, pushed out of his rightful seat on his own airline. He closed his eyes. The urge to speak rose in his chest, to reveal his identity, to shatter the ignorance with a single sentence. "I am the CEO of this airline." Yet he resisted. If he spoke too soon, the lesson would be lost. If he revealed himself in anger, the story would become about his title, not about the quiet truth that dignity should not depend on power. Instead, Malcolm reached into his pocket and drew out his phone. The screen glowed as he unlocked it. His finger hovered over an app hidden deep in the device, one only he could access. He hesitated. The weight of choice pressed on him. Was this the moment to awaken the fire he had kept banked for so long across the aisle? Samantha adjusted her camera. She didn't know his name, didn't know his history, but instinct told her she had just witnessed something bigger than a seat, something bigger than a flight. And as Malcolm's thumb brushed the screen, setting events into motion, the hum of the cabin shifted. The storm had just opened its eyes. The hum of the aircraft seemed louder as Malcolm Price made his way down the aisle. Briefcase in hand, the carpet beneath his shoes absorbed the weight of his silence. It was not the silence of defeat, nor of indifference, but of deliberate restraint. Each step felt deliberate, as though he were carrying not only his own dignity, but at the unseen dignity of many others who had been brushed aside, in quiet humiliation before him. Passengers shifted slightly in their seats as he passed. Some avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their magazines or the glowing screens in their hands. Others allowed their gaze to linger, curiosity and unease mingling in their expressions. A child, no older than 8, whispered to his mother, "Why can't he sit in the front?" The mother hushed him quickly, but her own eyes followed Malcolm with a conflicted weight. Behind him, Diana Lewis remained near the boarding door, her polished smile in place as she welcomed the next wave of passengers. Yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of tension. She had not expected the cabin to grow this still, to feel the weight of every glance pressing into her. Charles Whitman's voice drifted through the curtain, booming with laughter as he settled into what he called his usual seat. "Nothing like starting a flight with champagne," he said to no one in particular. His companions chuckled, eager to mirror his confidence, though their laughter rang hollow. Malcolm reached row 19, a window seat. He slid his briefcase into the overhead bin with slow precision, then lowered himself into the chair. The fabric was rougher here, the armrest narrower, the distance between the rows pressed against his knees. He did not fidget. He did not sigh. He simply folded his arms and looked forward, eyes fixed on the thin blue curtain ahead. To many, it was only cloth. To Malcolm, it was something heavier. It was the wall of prejudice, stitched not from fabric, but from assumptions. The kind that divided not just cabins, but entire worlds. Samantha Ortiz followed him with her camera lens, her heart racing. She had covered protests, community hearings, tense nights when police lights painted streets red and blue. But she felt something different here. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no raised fist, just a man walking quietly to row 19. And somehow, that quietness thundered louder than any protest chant. She zoomed in as Malcolm fastened his seatbelt. His face was composed, but his eyes carried something that pierced her. They were calm, yes, but beneath that calmness flickered the fire of someone who had chosen silence, not because he lacked words, but because he was waiting for the right moment. Malcolm turned to the window. Outside, the morning light stretched across the tarmac, illuminating other jets lined up like gleaming birds. He remembered mornings much like this, years ago, when North Star Airways was little more than a dream balanced on a knife's edge. He had been younger then, standing in a drafty hangar at dawn, staring at 3 aging jets whose engines coughed more than roared. Mechanics had looked at him with skepticism, asking if this dream of his could ever take flight. Flight attendants had wondered if passengers would trust a startup airline with planes older than their grandparents. He had convinced them not with promises of riches, but with the belief that dignity mattered more than luxury. He had told them an airline must carry not only people, but their sense of worth. And now, on his own airline, he was forced into a seat that told him and everyone watching you do not belong where you paid to be. The thought pressed against him, heavy as the fuselage surrounding the cabin. He felt a tightening in his chest, not anger, but something more profound, a recognition. This was not about him alone. This was about a culture that could erase dignity with a smile and a shrug. He closed his eyes for a moment. A part of him wanted to rise, to march back to the front, to reveal himself. "I am Malcolm Price, CEO of North Star Airways." The words trembled at the edge of his tongue, but he swallowed them. To speak now, in that way, would make the story about power, about title. If respect had to be earned through position, then respect was never truly respect at all. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He drew it out, the glow of the screen reflecting against the window. Hidden among the ordinary apps was one no one else on board would recognize. An icon without a name, a key only he could turn. Protocol Polaris. Malcolm's thumb hovered over it. He hesitated. The weight of the choice pressed down on him like turbulence shaking the fuselage. He thought of the employees who had trusted him, of the passengers who had flown North Star believing it was an airline that stood for something more. He thought of his daughter, still in college, who had once asked him why he worked so hard. He had told her, because every person deserves to feel like they belong. Was this the moment to awaken the mechanism built for crises, to turn a personal slight into an institutional reckoning across the aisle? Samantha lowered her camera for a moment, her chest tight. She whispered to herself, "This isn't ordinary. This is bigger than him. This is bigger than this flight." She felt it in her bones. The story unfolding in row 19 had the power to unravel illusions far beyond the cabin walls. A few rows behind Malcolm, a young attendant named Lily Chen walked briskly down the aisle, carrying a tray of headphones. She caught a glimpse of the man by the window, his hands folded, his gaze sharp. She had seen what happened at the gate, but had kept silent. Now her conscience tugged at her. Should she speak up? Should she risk her career by calling out her superior? She bit her lip, forcing her steps to remain steady. For now, she carried her silence. Though her heart screamed, the curtain rustled as Diana passed through, her heels tapping against the floor. She walked with the poise of someone who believed she had handled a minor inconvenience, but Malcolm's eyes never left her. His silence had already marked her choice into steel. From the front of the plane, Charles's voice carried again. On flights like this, people need to know their place, he said with a laugh, his words dripping with entitlement. A seat isn't bought with money. It's bought with the name behind it. Laughter followed, hollow clinks of champagne glasses sealing the sentiment. The sound seeped through the curtain, pressing into Malcolm's ears like a blade. He remained motionless, but inside, each word carved deeper into him. He was not the only one they were laughing at. They were laughing at every face ever told. "You don't belong here." His phone buzzed again, a small vibration against his palm. He turned the screen toward himself. 3 words glowed softly. Protocol Polaris. For a moment, the world around him blurred the chatter of passengers, the whir of the air vents, the faint announcements echoing from the cockpit. All of it fell away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat. Malcolm exhaled slowly, thumb brushing the glass. Not yet. Not until the moment was right. The hum of the engines deepened as more passengers boarded, the cabin filled with the shuffle of feet, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of magazines being folded. Yet around Malcolm, silence seemed to pool, a silence that stretched wider than a seat, wider even than row 19. Samantha raised her camera again, capturing the way he sat against the light streaming from the window. Through her lens, she saw something no one else noticed. The silence around him was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of power waiting for its moment to rise. And when the plane finally pushed back from the gate, the curtain still drawn tight, the wall between cabins still unbroken, Samantha knew with certainty this flight would not be an ordinary one. The engines of Flight 418 roared as the aircraft rolled steadily onto the runway. Passengers leaned back against their seats, some closing their eyes, others scrolling their phones, all lulled into the routine rhythm of takeoff. But for Malcolm Price, row 19 window seat. Routine had already shattered the moment he was pushed away from 2A. The plane lifted, wheels leaving the earth with a tremble that shivered through the cabin walls. The ground shrank beneath them. The horizon spread out in soft hues of gold and blue. Passengers around Malcolm murmured quietly, adjusting vents, tucking jackets, clicking open plastic cups of water. Life inside the fuselage seemed ordinary, yet beneath it ran a silent current that none of them could fully name. Malcolm stared out the window, watching clouds scatter like broken glass beneath the wings. He let the calm exterior remain, but inside him a storm was building. His thumb hovered over the hidden app on his phone. Protocol Polaris, a mechanism designed years ago in the quiet conference rooms of Northstar's headquarters. It had been his idea, one few even knew existed. Back then, he had told the board, "We need a safeguard, not for emergencies of metal or fire, but for emergencies of dignity." Some executives had scoffed, calling it unnecessary, but Malcolm insisted. He had lived long enough to know that prejudice often wore uniforms and polite smiles. Protocol Polaris was his silent failsafe. One touch would trigger an alert routed directly to the airline's operations center. Not flagged as customer service, not buried in reports, but escalated instantly to the highest chain of command. Cameras, logs, digital records would be pulled within seconds. And above all, the captain would be notified with verified footage. Now, sitting in row 19 with champagne laughter bleeding faintly through the curtain. Malcolm knew this was the moment. He hesitated still, his mind heavy with questions. Would activating it draw chaos mid-flight? Would passengers understand that this was not a tantrum, but a declaration? Would the world twist the story into something it was not? He closed his eyes and thought of his mother. He remembered her voice when he was a boy. Malcolm. Sometimes silence is strength, but sometimes silence is the chain they use to hold you down. You must know when to break it. His thumb pressed the screen. The app opened with a soft vibration. A red circle pulsed once, twice, then steadied. The words glowed. Protocol Polaris active. Hundreds of miles away, in a glass-walled building humming with screens and voices. The operations center of Northstar lit up with a sudden crimson flash on the primary console. Owen Marshall, 34, operations supervisor, leaned forward in his chair. His headset slipped slightly as his eyes widened at the name on the alert. Malcolm Price, CEO. His pulse spiked. He tapped furiously on his keyboard, pulling up flight data. Passenger manifest scrolled across his screen. Logs snapping open. Cabin CCTV cameras streaming live. He swallowed hard as the footage loaded. There it was. The chief attendant, Diana Lewis, ticket in hand. Her smile dimming as she told Malcolm his seat was unavailable. The camera caught the flicker in her eyes, the faint tilt of her chin, the calculated gesture as she waved him toward economy. Owen's gut twisted. He clipped the footage, timestamped it, encrypted the file, and sent it straight to the captain's secure channel. His hands trembled. He whispered under his breath, "This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice." Inside the cockpit, Captain Adrian Foster heard a chime on his tablet. He glanced at the notification, his brow furrowing. When he saw the name, his stomach clenched. He replayed the footage twice, jaw tightening, lips pressed into a line. The silence in the cockpit was heavy as he shut the tablet with a snap. His co-pilot glanced at him. Captain Foster didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his headset, exhaled, then pressed the intercom. "Chief Lewis, meet me in the forward galley. Now." His voice was sharp, iron cutting through the air. "In the first-class cabin." Diana's composure flickered. She excused herself from pouring champagne, her heels clicking as she disappeared through the curtain. Charles Whitman raised his brow but shrugged, turning back to his drink, his voice booming again about yachts and power lunches. In the galley, Foster stood waiting, arms folded. The narrow space hummed with the quiet buzz of equipment, but the air was heavy with unspoken tension. "Explain yourself," he said flatly. Diana tilted her head, smile returning. Though thinner now, it was a system error. "Captain, happens sometimes. I didn't want to delay, so I stop." Foster's voice was low, but every syllable hit like steel. "That wasn't an error. I saw the footage. That was your decision. And the passenger you reassigned to economy, that was Malcolm Price, the CEO." Diana's blood drained from her face. Heat flushed her cheeks, her polished mask cracking. "The CEO." She stammered. "I didn't know." "Not knowing is no excuse." Foster cut her off. "You humiliated him. You humiliated this airline, and I will correct it right now." The words sank into her like stones. She opened her mouth to protest, but shut it again, lips trembling. She turned her gaze downward, but it was too late. "In economy." The cabin murmurs quieted as the captain himself appeared in the aisle. Conversation stilled, headphones lowered, eyes turned. The authority of his crisp uniform commanded silence as he strode to row 19. Passengers leaned aside instinctively, creating a narrow path. Cameras lifted, subtle but ready, recording every step. "Mr. Price," Foster said, bowing his head slightly. His voice carried a solemn respect. "Please allow me to escort you back to your seat." Malcolm looked up, his gaze steady. For a moment, he considered the choice: to remain silent and seated, or to stand and reclaim what was his. He rose without a word, his steps slow, deliberate. The aisle seemed to part for him, passengers pressing back, their breath held in anticipation. Samantha's pulse hammered as she raised her camera higher. She captured it, the image of a man unjustly displaced, now walking back toward 2A, escorted not by apology, but by authority itself. No shouting, no argument, just silence. A silence heavy enough to shift the gravity of the cabin. In first class. Charles froze mid-laugh. His glass of champagne trembled in his hand as Malcolm stepped past the curtain. The presence of the captain at Malcolm's side made every whisper turn sharper, every phone tilt higher. Malcolm lowered himself into seat 2A. He fastened his belt, his expression calm, but his silence now carried a different weight. It was not the silence of patience. It was the silence of power. Samantha's video uploaded within seconds, spreading like wildfire. Notifications buzzed across her screen. The caption was simple: "Passenger denied first-class seat. Escorted back by captain." In the operations center, Owen Marshall's monitors lit with social media surges. The hashtag "Your Rightful Seat" began trending within minutes. His stomach twisted as he read the first wave of comments. "This is discrimination. Who is that man? Respect is not a privilege. It's a right." He leaned back, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The storm had started, and there would be no stopping it now. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was different. Passengers shifted uneasily, whispers darting through the rows. A student held up his phone, showing a seatmate. "Hey, look at this. This is our flight." The video Samantha had just uploaded flickered across the small screen, already climbing in views. Charles stared at his own phone, his smugness cracking as his name appeared in comments. He clenched his jaw, suddenly aware that his image might soon be tied not to yachts and power, but to entitlement and prejudice. Malcolm leaned back in 2A, his eyes closing briefly. He felt the weight of eyes on him, but he did not flinch. He thought again of his mother's words, of his employees, of every nameless passenger who had been told they didn't belong. He had not raised his voice, but the silence surrounding him had become thunder, echoing far beyond the cabin walls. And as the plane leveled out above the clouds, one truth was clear. Flight 418 was no longer just a journey to Seattle. It had become a stage, and every passenger, every camera, every whisper was part of the storm that had already begun to shake the world outside. The seatbelt sign blinked off with its familiar chime, yet no one in the cabin moved. The air felt heavy, as though every passenger sensed something unusual was unfolding, though they couldn't yet name it. Normally, when the captain escorted a passenger to their seat, the moment would pass quietly. But not today. Too many eyes had seen. Too many phones had recorded. In row 5, a college student named Marcus tapped his screen with wide eyes. "It's already on Twitter," he whispered to his friend. He turned the screen around, showing Malcolm's calm walk back to 2A. The caption beneath the clip was "Sharp black man with valid first-class ticket denied seat, escorted back by captain." The video had only been online for 15 minutes, yet the numbers were climbing like fire catching dry grass. Dozens of retweets, then hundreds, then thousands. A civil rights attorney added a comment. "This isn't just a mistake. This is a mirror of systemic bias in our daily lives." Samantha Ortiz's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down, her heart hammering. The view count was exploding, her notifications cascading so fast she could barely read them. Editors, journalists, activists, her inbox was filling with requests. "Who is the passenger? Can you confirm identity, secure an interview as soon as the flight lands?" She lifted her lens again, capturing Malcolm's profile against the glow of the window. His silence was unshaken, but she could see the depth in his eyes. It wasn't the expression of a man vindicated. It was the gaze of someone who understood the battle had just begun. Behind the curtain, Charles Whitman's composure was unraveling. He scrolled through his phone, his name already appearing in comments. Passengers online were identifying him as the white VIP who replaced the rightful seat holder. His temples tightened as he clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the prickle of shame that crept in despite his pride. He raised his voice louder than necessary, regaling his companions with another story about boardroom deals and power plays, but the laughter that answered him was thin, brittle. It sounded less like camaraderie and more like people afraid to be caught silent. In the galley, Diana Lewis's mask of professionalism was cracking. She moved quickly through tasks, pouring drinks, adjusting trays, anything to keep her hands busy. Yet whispers followed her wherever she went. Crew members exchanged quick glances. Passengers lowered their voices but not their eyes. Diana's chest tightened. She could feel it, the judgment, the scrutiny. She tried to swallow it down, but every smile she forced only seemed to make the weight heavier. Meanwhile, in the operations center, Owen Marshall's monitors pulsed with alarms. The hashtag, "Your rightful seat," had exploded into the top trending topic within half an hour. His hands shook as he updated the log. FOA liaison had just entered the monitoring channel. That meant the incident wasn't just viral, it was official. Every move from here on would be recorded in federal oversight. He dialed the cockpit on the secure line. "Captain Foster, FAA is monitoring. They've seen the footage. Maintain stability. They want a full report on landing." Foster's jaw tightened as he listened. He had flown through thunderstorms, through lightning that rattled the wings and ice that glazed the engines. But this storm was different. It wasn't outside. It was swelling inside the cabin, invisible but more dangerous than weather. He cut the line, glanced sideways at his co-pilot, and muttered, "Hold steady. This isn't just another flight." Back in seat 2A, Malcolm felt the shift. The curtain may have still divided first class from economy, but the invisible barrier had already been torn apart. He didn't need to look at his phone to know. He could feel the attention pulsing through the fuselage, the whispers bouncing row to row, the quick glances in his direction. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Inside, his thoughts twisted like turbulent winds. Had he done the right thing by activating Polaris? Was this too much for the crew, for the passengers, for the airline he had built from nothing? But then he remembered the sound of Charles's voice, sharp with entitlement. People need to know their place. He remembered Diana's cold smile as she redirected him, as though his presence in 2A had been a mistake. He thought of the countless faces passengers who had endured similar slights without a phone to record, without a captain willing to correct, without the power of a CEO to push back. This wasn't about his seat. It was about every seat. Across the aisle, Samantha caught his gaze for a brief second. She lifted her phone, showing him the screen. The video had already hit 500,000 views. Hashtags surged beneath it. Rightful seat. Respect first. North Star. Malcolm's eyes flickered, but he gave only a small nod. He understood now the silence he had chosen was no longer his alone. It had been amplified into a chorus. Lily Chen, the young flight attendant, walked quietly down the aisle. She stopped near Malcolm's seat, setting a bottle of water on the tray. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I saw what happened. I just want you to know, if you need me to speak, I will." Her words carried no pity, only courage. Malcolm gave a small nod, his lips curving into the faintest smile. That moment of human honesty mattered more to him than any apology Diana could ever muster. Passengers nearby noticed. A woman in row 6 whispered to her husband, "Do you see? He hasn't said a word, but everything around him is changing." Her husband nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Malcolm. "That's not weakness," he murmured. "That's power." The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft leveled above the clouds. Outside, the sky stretched vast and clear, but inside the cabin, the air felt tight, every breath charged with unspoken questions. What would happen when they landed? Would the airline bury it? Would the world move on as Charles had predicted? Or had the tide already turned too far to stop? Samantha's phone buzzed again. She glanced down. A national news anchor had retweeted her clip, adding only 3 words, "We are watching." Her chest tightened. She had been a freelancer chasing small assignments, but she knew in her gut this was different. She wasn't just covering a story. She was inside the story. At the back of the galley, Diana leaned against the steel counter, her reflection staring back at her from the polished surface. She whispered under her breath, "It was just a seat." But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was a lie. It had never been just a seat. Every second that passed carried them closer to Seattle, closer to the gate where the FAA, the press, and the public would be waiting. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, syncing his breath with the hum of the engines. He no longer thought about what he had lost. He thought about what must change. And though no one else could hear it, he whispered to himself, Respect is not a luxury, it's a promise. The promise now belonged not just to him, but to every soul who had ever walked down an aisle, only to be told they did not belong. The engines hummed like a steady heartbeat as Flight 418 cut through the thin air above the Rockies. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting a golden glow over first class. It should have been a space of calm, where champagne glasses clinked softly and conversations floated without weight. But tonight, the air carried an invisible electricity, a static that prickled skin and sharpened every whisper. Malcolm Price sat in 2A, his gaze fixed on the faint seam in the curtain before him. It was just fabric, no thicker than a coat sleeve, yet it had become a wall that symbolized everything he had fought against his entire life. Behind that fabric sat Charles Whitman, posture rigid, fingers drumming impatiently against the armrest. Charles's voice, once booming and careless, now carried an edge. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to the man beside him, loud enough for Malcolm to hear. "A seat turns into a spectacle, and the internet eats it up like starving dogs. They'll move on by morning." The words fell heavy, but no one answered, even his companions, once eager for his stories of yachts and boardrooms, were shrinking from him, their eyes darting to their phones instead. Charles shifted, irritation pressing into his bones. He hated silence when it wasn't his own. In the galley. Diana Lewis poured herself a paper cup of water, her hands trembling slightly. She took a sip, but it did nothing to wash away the dryness in her throat. Every laugh, every whispered glance felt like it was aimed at her. She kept hearing the word in her head, prejudice. She wanted to scream it wasn't fair, that she hadn't known who Malcolm was, that she hadn't meant anything by it. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial, she knew the truth. She had looked at Malcolm and seen someone who didn't belong in 2A. Her reflection stared back at her from the galley door-tired eyes. Forced smile, a moth slipping too fast to hold. She gripped the counter to steady herself, whispering. It was just a seat. But her voice cracked. Even she didn't believe it anymore. Far below, the world was shifting faster than she could imagine. In the operations center, Owen Marshall's screens flashed like alarms. Social media graphs spiked. Hashtags flared. News outlets picked up the story. FAA liaisons typed rapid messages into the secure channel, demanding updates in real time. Owen's pulse thudded as he fed them data footage, logs, timestamps. Each piece of evidence made it clearer. This wasn't going away. Back in the cockpit, Captain Adrian Foster tightened his grip on the controls. Though the skies outside were calm, he had seen the footage, heard Owen's voice tremble with urgency. Now the FAA was watching every move. His cabin was no longer just his responsibility. It was a stage under floodlights. He took a deep breath. His job wasn't just to land the plane. It was to land the truth. In row 7. Samantha Ortiz refreshed her feed. Her video had soared past 2 million views. Major anchors were commenting. A senator had tweeted, "If this is true, accountability must be immediate." Samantha's chest swelled with both exhilaration and fear. She wasn't ready for this kind of spotlight, but she couldn't turn away. Her camera lens stayed pointed at Malcolm, whose stillness seemed to speak louder than any words. Lily Chen walked the aisle, her steps careful. She set down a fresh bottle of water at Malcolm's side. Her voice was a whisper, meant only for him. "Sir, I want you to know you're not alone. Whatever happens, I'll stand by what I saw." Malcolm looked up, his calm eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. Those 2 words carried more weight than applause. because they acknowledged courage where it mattered most. Charles caught the exchange and scoffed, shaking his head. "Of course," he muttered, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now we're making him a hero for sitting down in a chair." He said it louder than he needed to, making sure half the cabin heard. Malcolm turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Charles's for the first time since being restored to his seat. There was no anger in his eyes, no fire of confrontation, only a steady calm, like still water reflecting a storm above. The silence between them stretched long enough to make Charles shift uncomfortably. For Malcolm, the silence was deliberate. Words could be twisted, debated, ignored, but silence, in its purity, left people to wrestle with themselves. Samantha's camera caught it, the unspoken clash of two men, one clinging to fading entitlement, the other anchored in unshakable dignity. She knew that still image alone could tell the world everything it needed to know. 30,000 feet above the earth. The tension grew thicker. Passengers fidgeted, some leaning across aisles to whisper, others sneaking glances at Malcolm as though waiting for him to erupt. But he did not. He sat still, his presence heavy, his silence like a tide pressing against the walls of the plane. Charles couldn't take it. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Do you think this changes anything? You got your seat back. Congratulations. But power doesn't live in Twitter comments. Power lives in names, in who people recognize when they walk through that curtain. And let me tell you something. You'll never change that." The words stabbed at the air, but they fell flat. A young passenger 2 rows back muttered just loud enough to be heard. Maybe he already has. The ripple of agreement was small, but Charles heard it. His ears burned. For the first time in years, his throne of 2-0 felt like nothing more than leather and steel. Malcolm exhaled slowly, eyes returning to the clouds outside. Inside, he wrestled with himself. His instinct was to stay silent, to let the storm outside the plane speak for him. But he also knew there would come a moment when he could not remain silent any longer. He would have to stand not just for himself, but for every passenger who had ever been told they didn't belong. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He wasn't just Malcolm Price, CEO. He was a symbol now, whether he wanted it or not, and symbols couldn't hide behind curtains. The plane jolted softly as it passed through a patch of turbulence. Gas fluttered through the cabin, hands gripping armrests, cups rattling in holders. But the true turbulence wasn't outside. It was inside, building with every minute, pressure mounting against the thin shell of composure. In the galley, Diana wiped her hands on her uniform, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. She wanted to walk down that aisle, to reclaim control, to tell Malcolm that she hadn't meant it, but fear rooted her in place. She knew the cameras were waiting. Any step she took now would be recorded, judged, dissected by millions. Instead, she stood still, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles whitened. Pride and fear battled inside her, neither side willing to let go. The minutes ticked by. Outside the windows, the sun slipped lower, painting the clouds with streaks of orange and violet. Inside, the cabin remained tense, every passenger aware that when the wheels touched down, the true storm would break. Malcolm closed his eyes, the roar of the engines merging with the beat of his heart. He thought of the early days, when North Star had nothing but 3 aging planes and a handful of employees who believed in him. Back then, he had told them, an airline isn't just about flying people, it's about carrying their dignity. That promise had been broken today, but he would make sure it was rebuilt stronger. He opened his eyes, the reflection of the sunset glowing in them. Whatever waited in Seattle FAA, press, public opinion, he was ready. Because respect was not a privilege. It was the foundation on which everything else stood. And as the hum of the engines carried them westward, every passenger in that cabin felt it too. This flight was no longer just about miles. It was about truth. And truth, once awakened, did not sleep again. The aircraft hummed steadily at cruising altitude, but inside the cabin, calm had long since departed. The passengers shifted in their seats, checking their phones, whispering in low voices. No one could escape it. The videos had gone viral. The weight of the storm pressed against the fuselage more heavily than the thin air outside. Malcolm Price sat quietly in 2A, hands folded over his lap. His posture was still, but inside, his thoughts wrestled with each other. He had spent his career building North Star Airways into a company that prided itself on integrity. He had given speeches about respect, about fairness, about every passenger being treated as more than a seat number. And yet here he was, reduced to a spectacle. The very values he had built now called into question by the actions of his own crew. He closed his eyes for a moment. The memory of Diana's words replayed in his head. Seat 2A is reserved for our VIP guest. The phrasing had been casual, smooth, as though she were discussing nothing more than a seating preference. But to Malcolm, it was a knife, disguised as a smile. He thought of the many others who had heard similar words, only without a camera to bear witness. A mother shifted to the back with her crying child. A student told to step aside for someone more important. Travelers who swallowed the sting of humiliation because they had no power to resist. His chest tightened. This was not just about him. The curtain separating cabins swayed slightly as Charles Whitman leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "This is absurd," he said, his tone carrying authority he no longer truly possessed. "The man is making a scene out of nothing. It's one seat." No one responded. The silence that followed was heavier than words. Charles looked around, his gaze searching for validation, but found only averted eyes and tight lips. For the first time in years, his command over a room had vanished. Samantha Ortiz's camera lens remained steady. She caught the flicker of Charles's jaw tightening, the way his companion shifted uncomfortably beside him. Through her viewfinder, the narrative was writing itself, the entitled man unraveling, the calm man holding the center, in the galley. Diana Lewis stood rigid, her hands clamped on the counter. She had always been in control, her crew respected her, passengers obeyed her, management trusted her to keep order. But now, every step she took felt unstable, as though the floor itself had tilted beneath her. She heard the whispers from passengers, the sharp clicks of phones recording, the occasional glance from Lily Chen that pierced like a question Diana didn't want to answer. Her mask of poise cracked. She pressed her palms against the steel counter, whispering under her breath. It was just procedure. It was just a seat. But she couldn't silence the memory of the look Malcolm had given her, the calm, steady gaze that had reflected back all the prejudice she had tried to deny. In operations, Owen Marshall rubbed his temples, eyes locked on the metrics. The hashtag "rear a rightful seat" had exploded past 5 million mentions in under 2 hours. News anchors were scheduling live coverage for when the flight landed. FIA representatives were confirming their presence at Seattle's gate. Owen typed updates furiously, his heart hammering. "Captain," he relayed through the secure channel. "FIA observers will be waiting on the jet bridge. This will be treated as a compliance incident under discriminatory conduct. Everything must be documented. Captain Adrian Foster exhaled slowly, nodding though Owen couldn't see him. He had flown through hurricanes, through storms that rattled metal and tested engines to their limits. But this was different. This storm wasn't measured in wind speed or lightning strikes. It was measured in eyes, millions of them, all watching, all waiting. He glanced back at the cockpit door. He knew the true turbulence wasn't outside. It was in his cabin, rippling through the rows like invisible lightning. Back in 2A. Malcolm tapped his thumb lightly against his armrest. He had remained silent because silence was stronger than outrage. But he could feel the tide shifting. His mind churned with the weight of choice. If he spoke now, every word would be amplified. If he stayed quiet, his silence would still echo louder than any explanation. His phone buzzed in his pocket with a soft vibration. He didn't need to check it to know what it was. Polaris protocol updates, social media metrics, legal alerts. The world outside had already turned his silence into a weapon. But the question pressed in on him like the cabin walls when the plane touched down. Would silence still be enough? Across the aisle. Lily Chen paused mid-step, her tray balanced carefully. Her eyes flicked toward Malcolm, and for a moment she saw him not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a man carrying a weight almost too heavy for one person. She wanted to say more, to offer comfort or solidarity, but she kept her words inside, afraid they might sound small against the roar of everything happening around him. Charles shifted in his seat again, frustration leaking into his movements. He turned toward Malcolm, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You really think this is about dignity? It's about power. You may run your company, but up here, it's the people who get recognized that matter. Money, names, influence, not sympathy videos." Malcolm's head turned slowly, his gaze steady, calm. He didn't reply. His silence was its own answer, and it made Charles's face flush red with irritation. He hated silence more than insults, because silence forced him to confront the weakness in his own words. Samantha's camera caught it all, the clash between arrogance and restraint, entitlement and dignity. She knew the footage would travel further than any article she could ever write. The story wasn't hers to tell anymore. It belonged to the world. The plane shuddered gently as it hit a pocket of turbulence. Gas rose, cups rattled, a baby cried in economy. But inside the hearts of passengers, another turbulence swelled, one of anticipation, fear, and the sense that they were part of something historic. Diana finally left the galley, her heels clicking softly against the aisle. She forced her posture straight, her smile fixed, but her eyes betrayed her. She stopped a few rows behind Malcolm, glancing toward him, searching for a sign that he might absolve her. But he didn't even look her way. His gaze remained fixed out the window, watching the sun dip lower, painting the clouds with streaks of violet and crimson. Her breath quickened. She wanted to speak, to explain, to insist she hadn't meant anything by it, but she couldn't. Every word she considered sounded like an excuse, and excuses wouldn't hold against the truth captured on 1,000 screens. She turned away, her heart pounding, the walls of her authority crumbling faster with every passing second. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Seattle shortly. Please remain seated until the sign is turned off." But the announcement did little to ease the tension. If anything, it sharpened it. Everyone knew what awaited at the gate cameras, officials, Headlines. The cabin was no longer just a cabin. It was a courtroom suspended in the sky. Malcolm leaned back, his fingers interlocked. He remembered the first time he sat in a cockpit, decades ago, as a young man dreaming of building something greater than himself. He had told himself then, one day, "I'll create an airline that makes every passenger feel they belong." He thought of that promise now. The irony of being forced to the back of his own airline was not lost on him, but he also knew this was his moment to prove the promise wasn't broken beyond repair. As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin lights flickered slightly. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the faces of passengers looked more like a gallery of witnesses than travelers. Some watched Malcolm with quiet admiration, others with unease, but all of them knew they were part of a story that would follow them long after the wheels touched down. Malcolm closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He felt the weight of expectation pressing in, but he also felt something else resolve. Respect was not a luxury. It was a promise. And tonight, that promise would be tested before the world. The plane tilted gently, beginning its descent through layers of cloud. But inside the cabin, the air was tense enough to snap. Seat belts clicked, trays locked, windows glowed with streaks of fading sunlight. It should have been a routine landing, yet everyone on board knew they were not simply returning to the ground, they were approaching a reckoning. Malcolm Price sat motionless in 2A. The leather seat had once felt like a victory reclaimed, but now it was a stage. His reflection in the window was calm, but his thoughts churned beneath the surface. He thought of the passengers behind him, their whispers, their stares, their phones capturing his silence. He thought of his employees waiting in Seattle, the FAA already preparing questions, and the millions watching through glowing screens. His father's voice drifted back to him. A lesson from long ago. Dignity isn't what people hand you. It's what you refuse to surrender. Malcolm clenched his fingers lightly around the armrest. He had refused to surrender when Diana stripped him of his seat. He had refused when Charles dismissed him with arrogance. But the true test lay ahead. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, the kind designed to calm nervous flyers. Yet it only seemed to sharpen the anticipation. Every glance turned toward 2A, where Malcolm sat still as stone. Even those who didn't know his name could feel it. He was the center of the storm. Charles Whitman leaned forward again, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think this circus will last? The internet forgets in a day. You'll be yesterday's news before you even step off this plane." His words carried, and passengers stiffened. Samantha Ortiz, camera in hand, caught the moment in crisp focus. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. His silence was louder than Charles's bluster. That silence drove Charles mad. He jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. "You've turned a simple misunderstanding into a spectacle. And for what? To make yourself a martyr. To humiliate a crew member who was just doing her job." Malcolm finally turned his head, his eyes locking on Charles. The cabin hushed, every ear tuned to hear what he might say. But Malcolm didn't speak. He simply looked at Charles, a gaze so steady, so unflinching, it hollowed the man's words of power. Charles faltered, his face reddening, his lips tightening. He looked away first. Samantha's camera caught it. The image of arrogance shrinking under quiet resolve would echo far beyond this flight. In the galley, Diana Lewis tried to steady her breathing. Every announcement, every word from the captain felt like a drumbeat leading to her downfall. She wanted to hide, to melt into the walls of the aircraft. but there was nowhere to go. The whispers of her crew, the passengers' sidelong glances, the knowledge that the FAA would be waiting it all crashed against her composure. Her mind replayed the moment she told Malcolm to leave his seat. She remembered the flicker of judgment in her own heart, the ease with which she assumed he didn't belong. She had called it procedure, but now she knew it for what it was, and there would be no hiding it. The intercom crackled. Captain Foster's voice came calm, measured, but with an edge of steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed by the FAA that compliance officers will be boarding this aircraft upon arrival. Please remain seated until instructed." Gas spread like ripples in a pond. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks. They had never heard an announcement like that. The reality set in. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was evidence. Owen Marshall's voice came through the secure cockpit channel. "Captain, news networks are preparing live broadcasts at the gate. They've confirmed the CEO is on board. FAA is requesting full cooperation." Foster answered with a terse nod. He had flown for decades, but never had a landing felt so much like walking into a tribunal. In row 7, a young woman whispered to her partner, "Do you think he'll speak? Do you think he'll actually say something when we land?" Her partner shook his head, but his eyes stayed fixed on Malcolm. "He already has. Look at him. He hasn't said a word, and still everyone's listening." Malcolm heard the murmur, but didn't shift. Inside, his thoughts wrestled. He remembered the early days of North Star Airways, when the company had only 3 planes and a handful of employees. He had promised them that respect would be the foundation of the airline, that every passenger, no matter their background, would feel valued. Now, that promise hung in the balance. The plane dipped lower, breaking through thick clouds. The city lights of Seattle shimmered below, scattered like jewels, but Malcolm's focus wasn't on the view. His focus was on what awaited: microphones, cameras, questions that demanded answers. Lily Chen passed by quietly, collecting empty glasses. She hesitated near 2A, then leaned slightly toward Malcolm. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "I know it isn't my place, but thank you for not yelling, for not making it ugly. It gave people like me courage." Her words struck him deeper than applause ever could. He gave a small nod. Lily's eyes glistened as she turned away, her hands shaking, but her heart steadier than before. Charles muttered something under his breath, but this time no one listened. His authority had evaporated. Diana finally walked down the aisle, her posture stiff. She paused near Malcolm, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She turned away quickly, retreating to the galley. The mask she wore for years had crumbled. The aircraft jolted as the landing gear dropped. The rumble beneath the floor was familiar, but it carried an unfamiliar weight. Passengers gripped armrests, not from fear of flying, but from the tension of what was about to unfold. Malcolm closed his eyes. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady against the rising roar of the engines. He remembered every moment of humiliation he had endured in boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where he had to prove himself twice over. And he remembered every promise he had made to his employees, to his passengers, to himself, that North Star would be different. The wheels struck the runway with a heavy thud. The plane shuddered, slowing as the engines roared in reverse thrust. Yet the usual applause never came. The cabin remained silent, as though every soul knew this wasn't a landing to celebrate. It was the opening of a trial. As the aircraft rolled toward the gate, phones lit up across the cabin. Screens glowed with headlines already spreading, North Star CEO humiliated on own airline. FAA to investigate viral incident. Passenger dignity versus airline culture. Malcolm opened his eyes, exhaling slowly. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He was resolved. The engines faded. The plane slowed to a crawl. Passengers craned their necks, peering through windows. Outside, flashes of cameras lit the gate area like lightning in a storm. Uniformed officers, FAA representatives, and clusters of reporters crowded near the jet bridge. Samantha held her camera steady, her pulse racing. She knew she was about to capture history. Captain Foster's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a full stop. FAA officers will board shortly." The seatbelt sign pinged, but no one moved. The silence was absolute, charged with anticipation. Malcolm remained still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. The door ahead hissed. The jet bridge clamped against the fuselage. The first click of the latch echoed through the cabin like a gavel striking wood. And in that moment, every passenger knew when the door opened, there would be no going back. The cabin was silent when the door clicked open. It wasn't the usual shuffle of passengers eager to stand and grab their bags. Instead, it felt like a courtroom waiting for the judge to walk in. The hiss of the jet bridge pressurizing against the fuselage echoed like a held breath finally released. 2 FAA compliance officers stepped inside first, crisp uniforms sharp under the harsh cabin lights. Their expressions were firm but unreadable, the kind that carried the weight of authority without a single word. Behind them came Amelia Grant, a senior FAA representative in her early 50s, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes cool and assessing. She scanned the cabin like someone who already knew the evidence, but wanted to see the stage where it had played out. Passengers stiffened in their seats. A ripple of whispers coursed through economy. Phones rose higher, capturing every second. The officers moved with slow deliberation, their presence shifting the atmosphere from tense to electric. Captain Adrian Foster met them near the galley, his jaw tight, his voice low but audible to those closest. "The cabin is secured. We're ready for your instructions." Amelia gave a curt nod. "We'll begin here." Her gaze flicked toward first class, where Malcolm Price sat in 2A, composed as ever. She didn't announce his name, but the way her eyes settled on him told everyone she already knew who he was. Diana Lewis was standing at the galley counter. Her smile stretched thin. For years she had worn that smile as armor, but now it felt brittle, fragile, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. She smoothed her uniform skirt, her voice catching as she turned toward Amelia. "Perhaps we could handle this after disembarkation, away from passengers, for privacy." Amelia's eyes sharpened. This incident happened in public. It will be addressed in public. The words cut through the air like a blade. Diana's smile faltered. Her hands tightened at her sides. Amelia gestured to the officers, then spoke loudly enough for the first rows to hear. "Mr. Price, please remain seated. Chief Purser Lewis, step forward." The cabin held its breath. Diana's heels clicked on the floor as she approached, each step heavier than the last. She stopped a few feet from Amelia, her face a mask of forced calm. Amelia held a tablet in her hand. She tapped it once, and the screen lit up with video footage. The angle was unmistakable Diana at the boarding gate. Malcolm's ticket in her hand, her voice directing him away from 2A. The audio was crystal clear. "Sorry, sir. This seat is reserved for our VIP guest." The footage ended. Amelia turned her gaze back to Diana. "Is this accurate?" Diana's throat worked. It was a judgment call. There was confusion with the manifest. I thought Amelia raised a hand. Answer the question. Is the footage accurate? The silence stretched. Finally, Diana whispered. Yes. Passengers leaned forward, eyes wide. Phones recording. A man in row 5 muttered, There it is. Amelia's voice stayed even, but it carried the weight of judgment. You knowingly reassigned a passenger with a valid first-class ticket. You justified it by invoking a supposed VIP priority that does not exist in regulation or policy. And that passenger was Malcolm Price, CEO of this airline? Correct. Diana's eyes darted toward Malcolm, then away. I didn't know who he was. Amelia's tone sharpened. That is precisely the problem. The standard of treatment should not depend on knowing who someone is. It should depend on the validity of their ticket. Nothing more. The words hit like a hammer. Diana's shoulders slumped. Malcolm sat quietly in 2A, his face unreadable. But his presence seemed to grow with every passing second. He didn't speak, yet every passenger could sense that the room was bending around him. Charles Whitman shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, he seemed unsure of his footing. His fingers drummed against the armrest, his usual smirk absent. Amelia turned toward Malcolm. Mr. Price, you are not required to make a statement at this time. But if you wish, the record is open. The cabin seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to Malcolm. Phones lifted higher. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. Malcolm inhaled slowly, then opened his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture dramatically. He simply spoke, his words steady and deliberate, each syllable cutting through the charged air. This is not about me, he said. It's about the culture we allow. A culture where assumptions decide who belongs and who doesn't. Where a ticket can be ignored if the face behind it doesn't match someone's picture of worth. Whispers rippled through the rows. Someone in economy murmured. He's right, Malcolm continued, his gaze steady. Today, I was the one moved aside. Tomorrow, it could be a mother with her child, a student traveling home, a veteran who has already given more than most. It doesn't matter if they're a CEO or not. It matters that they are human, and dignity, like safety, is not optional. The cabin erupted in quiet nods, murmurs of agreement. Even those who had tried to remain neutral felt the words strike something deep. Charles finally snapped, his voice sharp. This is grandstanding. You're turning a minor inconvenience into a crusade. Malcolm turned his gaze toward him, calm as ever. A minor inconvenience for you is a lifetime of humiliation for others. The only reason you call it small is because it doesn't happen to you. The cabin fell silent again. Charles's face flushed red, his mouth opening as if to respond. But no words came. He sank back into his seat, defeated by the sheer weight of Malcolm's composure. Samantha Ortiz's hands trembled as she filmed. She knew these words would flood every corner of the internet within minutes. Amelia nodded slowly, making notes on her tablet. Your statement is on record, Mr. Price, Chief Purser Lewis. Based on evidence and testimony, you are immediately suspended pending full investigation. Gas spread through the cabin. Diana's face went pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but Amelia's voice cut her off. This is not optional. You will disembark under escort. Do you understand? Diana nodded weakly, her lips pressed tight. The officers stepped closer, their presence firm but professional. Diana's hands trembled as she adjusted her jacket. Her mask of control finally shattered. She glanced once more at Malcolm, searching for something mercy, Perhaps, but his eyes remained steady, offering no refuge. Amelia looked back to Malcolm. "Do you have any final remarks before we proceed with the deplaning?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "Only this. Respect cannot be a privilege given at someone's discretion. It must be a standard. And tonight, that standard failed, but it will not fail again." The cabin broke into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Passengers clapped, some even standing, their faces alight with the relief of truth spoken aloud. Diana bowed her head, her face hidden, as the officers led her toward the exit. Charles stared at the floor, the weight of silence pressing down on him. Lily Chen watched from the galley, her heart racing, her eyes shining with something close to pride. Malcolm sat back in 2A, his hands folded once more. He didn't bask in the applause. He didn't smile. He simply sat with the weight of the moment, knowing it was only the beginning. Outside the window, the gate area swarmed with cameras, reporters pressed against the glass, flashes popping like fireworks. The world was waiting. And when Malcolm stepped off this plane, the storm would break in full. The officers guided Diana Lewis toward the front of the cabin, her heels clicking against the floor with the sound of someone walking toward the end of a career. Passengers watched, phones raised, the applause that had filled the cabin moments ago fading into a thick silence. Diana's once flawless posture sagged. She kept her eyes down, as if the stares of 100 witnesses could pierce her more deeply than any punishment to come. The door opened wider. A rush of cool air spilled in from the jet bridge, carrying the muffled roar of voices beyond. Reporters were already shouting, their words muffled but relentless, echoing through the narrow tunnel. Camera flashes burst like distant lightning, their glow leaking into the cabin. Malcolm Price remained seated in 2A, composed, his hands folded on his lap. His expression was unreadable, but inside, his thoughts churned. He knew that once he stood, the silence he had carried like armor would break into sound. The world would demand words, and those words would be carved into memory. Captain Adrian Foster stood nearby, his uniform impeccable, but his face betrayed the tension he held inside. He had flown through hurricanes, yet this was different. This was history unfolding in his aircraft, and he was painfully aware that his role was no longer only to land planes safely, but to steady a company trembling under the weight of its own culture. "Mr. Price," Amelia Grant said quietly, stepping closer to his seat, "the FAA is ready to escort you. The press will be waiting. You can choose to remain silent, but if you do speak, every word will matter." Malcolm's eyes lifted to hers. "Every word always matters," he replied softly. She nodded once, recognizing the resolve in his tone. Samantha Ortiz gripped her phone tightly, recording as if her life depended on it. She had been chasing stories for years, scraping together freelance gigs, but she knew with certainty that this moment would define her career. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what she was witnessing. The first-class curtain parted, and Diana disappeared down the jet bridge, flanked by officers. A murmur ran through the passengers. The execution of justice was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable. Amelia gestured gently. "Mr. Price, it's time." Malcolm rose slowly. The motion was simple, but it seemed to shift the entire cabin. Passengers straightened in their seats. Whispers ceased. Phones steadied in hands. The aisle became a corridor of expectation. As Malcolm stepped forward, people instinctively leaned away, creating space. Some lowered their heads in quiet respect. Others kept their eyes locked on him, as if memorizing every detail of the moment. "In the rear of the cabin," a student whispered. "He hasn't shouted once. Not once. But look at him. Everyone is following." Malcolm entered the narrow jet bridge, the air thick with noise. The clamor of reporters swelled instantly. Microphones thrust forward, camera shutters exploding in rapid succession. Flashes illuminated his face in staccato bursts, transforming his calm expression into an icon in real time. "Mr. Price, what happened in first class?" One reporter shouted. "Was this discrimination?" another demanded. Our heads going to roll at North Star questions bombarded him from all directions, colliding into an indistinguishable storm of words. He walked steadily, ignoring the chaos until he reached the end of the bridge. The terminal beyond was packed, a sea of faces, cameras, and raised phones. Security officers struggled to contain the crowd, their voices drowned beneath the roar. Reporters shouted his name again and again, their voices competing like waves crashing against a shore. Malcolm stopped in the center of the gate area. He turned slowly, scanning the crowd. The flashes lit him from every angle, but he didn't flinch. The roar quieted slightly, the way a restless audience stills when the curtain rises. He raised his hand, palm outward, and the silence deepened. "I will answer 3 questions," he said, his voice clear, steady, carrying over the chaos without effort. "Only 3. After that, I have work to do." The crowd erupted, dozens of reporters shouting at once, their voices overlapping in desperate urgency. Amelia Grant lifted a hand, pointing to a young reporter in the front. "Mr. Price," the reporter stammered, his microphone trembling. "Was what happened to you a mistake? Or was it deliberate?" Malcolm's eyes fixed on him, steady and unwavering. "It was deliberate," he said. "A decision, not an error. A decision made on the assumption that I did not belong. And every passenger, not just me, deserves protection from decisions like that." The typing of keyboards filled the air. A ripple ran through the crowd. Cameras clicked faster. A second reporter leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Do you believe this was about your race?" Malcolm paused for a long beat, letting the silence stretch until the weight of anticipation pressed on every chest. He looked directly into the nearest camera, his gaze piercing. "I believe assumptions were made about me that would not have been made about someone else. When assumptions turn into actions, we are no longer talking about service. We are talking about prejudice. And prejudice, in any form, has no place in this industry." The words cracked like thunder. Reporters shouted to repeat them. Phones shot higher into the air. Across the terminal, passengers broke into applause, the sound echoing through the high ceilings. The third question came from a familiar voice. Samantha Ortiz, who had pushed her way to the front, spoke with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. "Then, sir, what happens next?" Every lens swung toward him. Every microphone reached closer. The silence deepened until even the hum of the terminal seemed to vanish. Malcolm's answer came low but firm, each word distinct. "What happens next is this culture will change, or those unwilling to change will leave." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, and shouts filled the space. The 3 sentences spread instantly, live-streamed, tweeted, clipped, shared. Within minutes, they would circle the globe. Reporters clamored for more. But Malcolm lifted his hand again. "I said 3 questions, and I keep my word." 2 security officers moved forward, carving a path through the crush of microphones and cameras. Reporters shouted his name, But Malcolm walked steadily, his stride measured, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't look back. Behind him, passengers from Flight 417 emerged into the terminal, their own phones raised. Many wore expressions of awe, as if they had just stepped out of a moment that would live far beyond their lifetimes. A middle-aged woman held her son's hand tightly, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Do you see? That's why we speak up." The boy nodded, his eyes wide, fixed on Malcolm's retreating figure as though looking at a living symbol. Inside the conference room, beyond the press, a long table waited. Water glasses gleamed beneath fluorescent lights. Compliance officers shuffled papers, preparing transcripts, evidence, consequences. But in the terminal, the story had already outgrown paperwork. Hashtags flared online. Their rightful seat. Dignity in flight. North Star storm. Within 30 minutes, television screens across the country would broadcast his calm face. His 3 sentences replayed again and again. In that moment, Malcolm knew this was no longer about one man or one flight. It was about every passenger who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was about changing not just a company, but an industry. And as the doors of the conference room closed behind him, shutting out the roar of the crowd, he felt no triumph, no relief, only the steady weight of responsibility. The fight was no longer in the cabin. It had shifted to boardrooms, to headlines, to policies, and he was ready. The heavy glass doors shut behind Malcolm Price, sealing off the roar of the terminal. The sudden quiet was almost jarring, like stepping from a hurricane into a vacuum. The conference room was brightly lit, the fluorescent glow washing every corner with a harsh honesty. At the long mahogany table sat FAA representatives, compliance officers, and North Star Airways executives hurriedly summoned to the scene. Amelia Grant, the FAA's senior representative, stood at the head of the table. Her presence filled the room more than her stature. Beside her, 2 officers tapped on tablets, already pulling up files, timestamps, and recordings. At the far end of the table sat Diana Lewis, her uniform still crisp but her posture unraveling, shoulders tight, eyes darting between the officials and the man she had tried to brush aside. Malcolm entered calmly, carrying nothing but his leather case. He did not look around the room for approval, nor did he acknowledge the executives whispering among themselves. He simply took a seat opposite Amelia and folded his hands, as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Amelia tapped her pen once against a notepad, the sound sharp. "We are here to examine the events that occurred aboard Flight 417. This session is being recorded. Mr. Price, Miss Lewis, and all present are bound by the obligation of truth." Diana cleared her throat, her voice unsteady. "I would like to state for the record that there was confusion. The manifest showed an irregularity." And Amelia's voice cut through, calm but firm. "We have already verified the manifest. There was no irregularity. What we do have is video footage." She nodded to one of the officers. The tablet screen rotated, playing the now viral clip Diana holding Malcolm's boarding pass. Her smile tight, her words unmistakable. "This seat is reserved for a VIP guest." The room fell silent as the short clip looped once more. Diana's lips trembled. "I didn't know he was the CEO," she whispered, the words clinging to the air like a fragile excuse. Malcolm finally lifted his gaze to her. His voice was even, but there was steel beneath it. "That is the problem, Ms. Lewis. It should not have mattered who I was. The ticket was valid. The seat was mine. But you looked at me and decided otherwise." The executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a silk tie, spoke up. "Perhaps we can address this internally, with retraining or a formal apology." Malcolm's eyes cut to him, quiet but unyielding. "You think this is about smoothing ruffled feathers. This is about a culture where prejudice can disguise itself as procedure, and I will not allow that culture to continue." The executive faltered, his words drying up under the weight of Malcolm's composure. Amelia leaned forward, her tone precise. "Mr. Price, as CEO, what immediate measures do you propose?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, his mind flashing back to his early years when North Star was nothing more than 3 leased jets and a rented hangar. Back then, every employee had looked to him for vision, for a promise that their airline would not just carry people through the skies, but uphold their dignity. That promise had been broken today, and he would rebuild it publicly, piece by piece. He spoke with clarity. "First, Ms. Lewis will be suspended effective immediately pending full investigation. Second, every reassignment decision for the past 3 years will be audited. Third, every senior crew member will undergo mandatory bias and dignity training within the next 30 days. And fourth, from this moment forward, every reassignment of a seat must be logged, justified, and reviewed by an independent body." Amelia nodded, her pen scratching across the paper. "And this independent body, who will oversee it?" Malcolm's eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on the young flight attendant Sophie Delgado, who had chosen to speak earlier in the cabin. "We will create what I will call the Beacon Council," he said. "It will include passenger representatives, FAA oversight, and employees willing to speak the truth. Even when it is difficult, transparency will no longer be optional." The words landed heavily. Executives exchanged uneasy glances. To them, this was not just policy. It was accountability that could no longer be hidden. Diana finally broke, her voice trembling. "You're destroying me. One mistake, and you are ending my career." Malcolm's gaze softened, but his words remained unwavering. "You ended your career with your choice. I am not here to destroy you. I am here to ensure no one else endures what I did. Every passenger deserves the dignity of their seat." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Amelia's eyes met Malcolm's, and for the first time that day, her expression carried the faintest glimmer of respect. "Your proposals," she said, "will be entered into the FAA record as binding commitments. Failure to comply will result in federal intervention." Malcolm inclined his head. "Then let us begin compliance immediately." One of the executives leaned forward, desperation in his tone. "But the press outside this will devastate our brand. The market will react violently." Malcolm's voice cut through like a gavel. "The market will recover. What it will not forgive is silence. We will face this head on, or the company does not deserve to survive." Owen Marshall, the operations supervisor who had triggered the Orion protocol, stood at the side of the room, silent until now. His chest tightened as he listened. He had always believed in Malcolm, but hearing these words turned belief into conviction. He whispered to himself, almost in awe, "He's turning humiliation into reform." Amelia stood, her posture decisive. "The FAA will issue a preliminary statement within the hour. Mr. Price, you may address the press once more. But know this, your words have already reshaped the conversation. Choose them carefully." Malcolm rose, picking up his worn leather case. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He looked around the room, At Diana with her eyes lowered, at the executives pale with unease, at the FAA officials jotting down records that would soon become policy. "This is not just about North Star," he said quietly. "This is about the entire industry. The culture of the skies must change, and if it begins with one seat, then so be it." He walked toward the door. The officers opened it, and once again, the roar of the terminal rushed in, a tidal wave of cameras, questions, and shouts. He did not pause at the threshold. He stepped into the storm as though it were the path he had always meant to walk. Back inside. Diana slumped in her chair, tears brimming in her eyes. An executive whispered furiously about damage control, but Amelia silenced him with a look. The clock ticked on the wall, each second reminding everyone that history was moving forward, and no amount of denial could stop it. For the passengers waiting in the terminal, for the millions watching live, for every traveler who had ever been told they did not belong. The story of Flight 417 was no longer just news. It was a reckoning. The doors opened again, and Malcolm Price stepped back into the terminal. The noise rose immediately, a swelling roar of voices and flashing lights. Reporters surged forward, passengers crowded closer, and camera shutters exploded in staccato bursts. For a brief moment, it felt less like an airport and more like a courtroom where the verdict was about to be spoken. Security officers flanked Malcolm, but he raised his hand gently, signaling them to hold back. He wanted no barrier between himself and the people. The crowd quieted slightly, expectant. His silence worked the same way it had in the cabin, pulling every gaze toward him, commanding without force. Amelia Grant followed at a measured distance, observing. She had seen executives before, men who blustered, shouted, or hid behind rehearsed statements. Malcolm was different. His composure was not a performance. It was a truth lived into being. Malcolm set his leather case on a nearby counter, unzipped it slowly, and pulled out his folded boarding pass. He held it high above the forest of microphones. The thin slip of paper glowed under the terminal's harsh lights. "This," he said, his voice steady and clear, "is not just a piece of paper. It is a contract between an airline and its passengers. When you pay for a seat, you are not buying luxury. You are buying dignity. You are buying trust. And when that trust is broken, the entire system shakes." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling outward. Phones captured every syllable. Social media feeds erupted in real time, hashtags multiplying. He lowered the pass and continued, "What happened on Flight 417 was not a glitch, not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And choices like that reveal the cracks in our foundation. They show us how quickly respect can be stripped away when prejudice disguises itself as policy." Passengers in the crowd nodded, some clapping softly. A young man raised his phone high. "Streaming live. Listen to him," he whispered to his viewers. "He's telling the truth for all of us." Malcolm's eyes swept the room. He spoke more slowly now, each word deliberate. "I will not allow this to be buried. From this moment forward, North Star Airways will log and review every seat reassignment. An independent body, the Beacon Council, will oversee it. Passenger representatives will have a voice, and every senior crew member will undergo training to ensure that respect is not a privilege handed out selectively, but a promise honored universally." The declaration drew applause, scattered at first, then building until the terminal reverberated with the sound. Reporters leaned forward, desperate to push through the noise. One called out, "Mr. Price, what about Ms. Lewis?" What about the crew responsible? Malcolm's expression remained calm. The FAA will complete its investigation. Accountability is not optional, but this is bigger than one individual. It is about the culture that allowed such a choice to feel acceptable. That culture ends today. The words struck harder than any punishment of one person. They cut to the core. The executive standing behind Amelia shifted uneasily. They knew the tide was irreversible. Malcolm continued, his tone dropping lower, drawing people closer. I began this company with 3 planes and a promise. I told my team then that every passenger mattered, every seat mattered, every flight was about dignity as much as distance. Somewhere along the way, that promise was forgotten. I am here to remind us all. Respect is not an upgrade. It is the foundation that keeps us aloft. Phones buzzed with notifications as the quotes spread like wildfire. Television crews outside the terminal broadcast live feeds. Commentators interrupted regular programming to air the words of the CEO standing in his own gate area. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. He felt the weight of thousands of eyes, millions more beyond the walls. He thought of the early mornings in the hangar, the trust of the engineers who had believed in him, the countless passengers who had endured silent prejudice without cameras to capture it. This was for them. When he opened his eyes again, the determination in them was unmistakable. To every passenger listening, whether you fly with us or not, know this: you deserve your place, you deserve your seat, and you deserve respect. That will be my promise, and I will not break it again. The applause swelled louder, echoing through the terminal like thunder. Some passengers wiped tears from their eyes. A woman near the back clutched her daughter's hand, whispering, "Remember this moment. This is what courage looks like." Samantha Ortiz, standing near the front with her camera rolling, felt her throat tighten. She had covered protests, scandals, even wars, but she knew with certainty that this would be the defining clip of her career. Not because Malcolm was powerful, but because he had chosen to wield that power for something larger than himself. Amelia stepped forward, her voice rising above the crowd. "These commitments are now entered into FAA record. They will be enforced. This is not a statement for cameras. It is policy." The crowd erupted once more, phones buzzing with alerts that federal oversight had been confirmed. The hashtags surged higher. My rightful seat, dignity in flight, North Star promise. Through the roar, Malcolm remained still. He lowered the boarding pass, sliding it back into his case. He spoke once more, quieter than before, but the microphones carried his words. This was never just about Seat 2A. It was about every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong. Today, we reclaim that belonging together. With that, he stepped back, signaling the end. Security created space, guiding him toward a side exit. Reporters shouted for more, but Malcolm did not respond. His silence spoke louder than any speech could. As he walked away, passengers applauded again, some rising to their feet. The echo followed him down the corridor. Amelia watched with a mix of relief and admiration. She had expected to enforce, but what she had witnessed was transformation. Behind them, Diana Lewis was escorted quietly toward another exit. Her shoulders slumped, her professional smile gone. The terminal's cameras followed her, but the story had already shifted. It was no longer about her alone. It was about the culture she had embodied and the promise now sworn to end it. Outside the terminal, the evening sky glowed faintly. News vans crowded the curb, satellites pointing skyward. Commentators spoke urgently into cameras, their words punctuated by breaking news banners. Stock tickers scrolled across screens. North Star's shares dipping and then steadying as Malcolm's declaration replayed. Owen Marshall, back at the operations center, watched the feeds with a pounding heart. He whispered to himself. He turned one seat into a movement. Around him, staffers worked feverishly, answering calls, updating systems, already preparing to enact the new protocols. And across the country, in living rooms, airports, and phone screens, people watched. Some nodded, some argued, but none could ignore. The silence that had begun in row 18 had thundered into a national reckoning. The applause from the terminal still echoed faintly in Malcolm Price's ears as he was guided through a secured corridor toward a smaller hall reserved for press briefings. The air smelled of disinfectant and old carpet, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He walked steadily, his leather case in hand, while security and FAA officials formed a protective circle around him. Yet Malcolm did not feel shielded. He felt exposed, stripped of any distance between his personal truth and the world that now demanded it. Inside the hall, a modest podium awaited. Reporters packed every inch of space. Microphones lined up like a small army pointed toward him. Television crews had already gone live, anchors whispering excitedly in earpieces as the countdown to his appearance ticked away. Amelia Grant, calm as ever, adjusted her blazer and leaned toward Malcolm. "Once you speak here, Mr. Price, the words will travel far beyond Eastport. They will define how this story is remembered." Malcolm gave a slight nod. He already knew. The silence he had carried on the plane was over. Now, it was time for his voice. He approached the podium. Conversations died instantly. The red lights on cameras glowed. For a moment, Malcolm simply rested his hands on the edges of the podium, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then he began. "When I boarded Flight 417 this morning, I carried nothing more than a boarding pass and a belief that my place on that plane had been rightfully earned. Within minutes, that belief was challenged, not by error, but by choice. I was told that my seat was reserved for someone more important. That judgment was made not by the system, but by a person who looked at me and decided I did not belong." Murmurs rippled through the hall, reporters scribbling furiously. I chose silence then, not because I was powerless, but because silence can speak when words fall short. Yet silence alone does not build change. Action does. Today, you have seen what happens when one act of prejudice is exposed in the light. The world does not turn away. It demands better. He paused, scanning the crowd. Samantha Ortiz, camera raised, met his eyes and felt her pulse quicken. She knew these words would anchor broadcasts across the country. Let me be clear. This is not about one seat or one flight attendant. It is about a culture that has too often allowed dignity to be optional. That culture ends here. North Star Airways will not simply apologize. We will reform. Starting now, every reassignment will be logged, reviewed, and made public. Every senior crew member will undergo training, not to memorize rules, but to understand what respect truly means. And the Beacon Council will ensure transparency that cannot be hidden behind curtains or titles. The flash of cameras was relentless. Passengers watching on live streams clapped in living rooms and airport lounges. Some cheered, some cried softly, remembering their own moments of dismissal and disrespect. Malcolm leaned closer to the microphones, his voice lowering into a steady rhythm. We do not sell seats. We sell trust. And when trust is broken, the price is far greater than any ticket. I will not allow that price to be paid again. The hall erupted in applause. Not the polite kind, but a raw sound of agreement. Even some of the executives who had arrived pale with worry now found themselves clapping, their fear replaced by the recognition of necessity. A young reporter raised his voice. "Mr. Price, do you believe the industry will follow your lead?" Malcolm met the question with a calm nod. They will have no choice, because passengers will demand it. Because once dignity has been claimed in the open, no one will accept its absence in the shadows. This is not just a North Star promise. It is a declaration for the skies themselves. The statement sent another ripple of applause. Amelia Grant leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, though the faint lift at the corner of her mouth betrayed approval. Malcolm straightened. "There is one last thing I will say. To every passenger who has ever been brushed aside, who has been told they are less than deserving, let this moment remind you your worth is not up for negotiation. A seat can be purchased, but respect must be defended, and we will defend it every single time." The words thundered through the hall. The applause was overwhelming now, echoing off the walls like a storm. Malcolm stepped back from the podium. He raised his boarding pass once more, then lowered it gently into his case. He did not need to linger. His point had been made. He turned and walked off stage, the cameras still flashing, the crowd still chanting his name. As he exited, Amelia caught up to him. "That will be remembered," she said quietly, "not just as a statement, but as a turning point." Malcolm looked at her, his eyes steady. "It was never just about me. It was about everyone who flies." Outside, the night air was cool against his skin. The chaos of cameras followed. But Malcolm felt an unexpected calm. He thought of the maintenance hangar years ago, of the first employees who had believed in him, of the thousands of nameless passengers who would never know his face, but would feel the weight of the changes made today. In another wing of the terminal, Diana Lewis sat alone, waiting for her escort. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, scrolling through headlines that painted her choice as the spark of a storm. She whispered to herself, "It was just a seat." But even she knew now it had never been just a seat. Sophie Delgado, on the other hand, stood by the gate where it had all begun. She watched passengers dispersing, many still talking about the man in 2A. She felt her own heart steady with resolve. She had chosen to speak, to bear witness, and now her voice mattered. She promised herself she would never return to silence. Back at the operations center, Owen Marshall sat before glowing screens, analytics racing upward, hashtags trended across continents, politicians tweeted support, civil rights groups issued statements within minutes. His colleagues stared in awe. Owen whispered. He turned humiliation into a promise. By midnight, every major network replayed Malcolm's words. Commentators dissected his calm, his silence, his transformation of a single injustice into a declaration of reform. Passengers across the country watched, some nodding firmly, others wiping tears. Parents pointed to the television, telling their children, "That is what leadership looks like." The next morning, North Star Airways stock dipped briefly, then surged upward as investors recognized the power of integrity. Other airlines scrambled to draft statements, some announcing audits within hours. The FAA confirmed oversight would expand across the industry. For Malcolm, it was never about the market. It was about the passengers. And as he sat alone that night in his hotel room, the city lights glowing beyond the window, he allowed himself a single breath of weariness. He thought of his family, of the people who had believed in him when the airline was only an idea, of the countless travelers who would board planes tomorrow with no idea of his name, but with dignity safer than it had been the day before. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "Respect is not a luxury. It is a foundation." And with that, the storm that began with silence finally settled into history. And so, a seat that was denied became a symbol for millions. Malcolm Price's silence turned into words that echoed far beyond a single flight, challenging not just one airline, but an entire industry to remember that respect is not optional. This was never only about a black CEO. It was about every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong. It was about dismantling the invisible walls of prejudice and affirming the simple truth. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. Tonight, as we leave this story behind, let us carry its weight with us. Let us remember the quiet strength it takes to stand, the courage to speak, and the responsibility to never look away when injustice unfolds before our eyes. If this story moved you, let it not end here. Share it with others, talk about it, and keep the conversation alive. Together, we can make sure no passenger ever has to fight for their rightful place again. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you're here with us for the next story, one that will challenge, inspire, and remind us all of the power of truth.